Over the past number of weeks, Canadian security agencies have been actively pursuing credible allegations of a potential link between agents of the government of India and the killing of a Canadian citizen, Hardeep Nijjar.
Hello and welcome, and thanks for joining me on Second Opinion, where our subject today will be Canada's Prime Minister and his somewhat puzzling crusade against the Indian government. As we've just seen, he accused in public, in his parliament, of committing an act of cold-blooded murder. So after such a dramatic, sensational charge, why did Justin Trudeau fail to come up with some proof, anything at all, to substantiate it, until the United States stepped in more than 2 months later? At the end of March 2024, or half a year after he'd first kicked off his show, Trudeau had this to say.
Our responsibility to protect all Canadians from illegal actions by foreign governments is something that, as a country grounded in diversity, we need to take very seriously. We're looking to work constructively with the government of India to get to the bottom of this.
Once again, nothing more there. I don't know if I'm stupid, but what exactly does being grounded in diversity, as Trudeau puts it, add to his case? Or rather to his claims against India. His claims, what he himself acknowledged when he spoke about it for the first time in his parliament, were allegations, not evidence, but allegations of a potential link between the killing of Khalistani activist Hardeep Nijjar and Indian government agents. So why then was Justin Trudeau in such a tearing hurry to level charges? Today here on Second Opinion, let's look for explanations. There are a host of hints and clues, potential answers, involving the US and China, Canadian regional politics, and secrets about Justin's own father. There's also the aftermath of a sordid bribery and corruption scandal, which went up quite messily right to the top, and a need by Trudeau for Khalistan supporting swing voters. Last but not least, are internal rivalries and agendas at his own secret services. These, as we'll be seeing, directly concern issues ranging from Hardeep Nijjar in Khalistan to Nazis out of Ukraine. Much of this came to a head within just a few weeks before and after Hardeep Nijjar's death on June 18th last year. Some, if not all of these, might explain just why Don Justin chose to tilt like Don Quixote, but in his case at a giant Indian windmill. The most likely scenario is that Trudeau was simply relaying a message to India from the US government. But why? What would the United States want to achieve here? Well, what it already has achieved: to embarrass India in public, put it on the defensive. And what would such a public message to India via Justin be about? Well, the Ukraine conflict, India's crude oil purchases from Russia and its refusal to condemn Vladimir Putin for the invasion of Ukraine, Iran, Indian investments in Iran's Chabahar port, India's cozying up to France in Africa, BRICS, maybe the Modi government's unwillingness to be used against China, or its preference for Donald Trump. Who knows? We can only guess. The Americans, like the Lord, move in mysterious ways. They make their own rules. They call it the rules-based international order. It's a place where international law gets bent. Not broken, but bent creatively to suit the US when international law simply cannot keep up. US allies, junior partners and bit players on Team America, from Egypt and Romania to Britain, Belgium and Germany must play according to these rules. By relaying the US message to India, Canada clearly has. Never mind what will happen after all this is over to poor Justin, as soon as the US strikes a deal with India behind his back. Oh yes, that will happen. It is the other side of the rules-based international order, that of the expendable American ally. Ask Pakistan about Raymond Davis, the CIA contractor who shot 2 Pakistanis dead in Lahore. US President Obama suddenly decided to call Davis a diplomat, which meant he would have diplomatic immunity. Then, diplomat or not, as this Pakistani paper remarked, he was flown out of Lahore on an American military airplane, the US ambassador seated next to him, just in case someone back there changed their minds about the deal which the Americans had shoved down their throats. Pakistanis chose to be stoic about the show, until back in the US, Davis wrote a book bragging about his exploits, no longer as a diplomat, but what he really was, a CIA contractor. Then of course there are the US Navy choppers slipping in silently to land a few hundred yards from the front gate of the Pakistan Military Academy at Abbottabad to take out Osama bin Laden. Was that an extrajudicial execution too, like what Justin Trudeau has accused India of doing to Hardeep Nijjar? Or was Pakistan told about Osama's killing in advance and given no choice, like Trudeau, about Nijjar?
But then it's not just Pakistan or Canada. Few US allies escape such treatment. Even so-called special friends like Britain, where Anne Sakulas, wife of an American diplomat, killed a motorcyclist on the road in 2019, then fled to the US and claimed diplomatic immunity, just like Raymond Davis in Pakistan. I'm not interested in good or bad, or right or wrong, simply in a statement of fact. We'll see how the US treated the serving Chancellor of Germany and ask why there would be any difference in the case of Canada. In short, if the US saw benefit in using Justin Trudeau to send a message to India, it certainly would have.
The timeline of American involvement lends weight to such a hypothesis that the Canadian crusade against India may have been simply outsourced by the US to Justin Trudeau. Pay attention as we go along to the months or dates here. In May 2023, 4 months before Justin accused India, the United States apparently had information about a second Indian hit job on Gurpatwant Singh Pannun, another Khalistani target, this one in New York. The hitman was apparently an undercover American government agent. While keeping watch on Pannun, the Americans learned about the pending hit in Canada, or say they did. This was in June. Then, for some reason, they kept quiet for 5 whole months until late November, when they leaked the story. There is one troubling question here. If the Americans had given Justin the information they had, say they had on June the 12th, Nijjar's death 6 days later may well have been prevented. Let's take a look at the indictment. These here are the details according to the Americans, with the 2 dates I just mentioned. June the 12th at the top, referring to a big target in Canada, and June the 18th at the bottom, which mentions Nijjar's killing. Gupta, Nikhil Gupta, a guns and drugs smuggler, is alleged to have planned the New York hit in coordination with an India-based controller, an unnamed ex-CRPF Central Reserve police officer, who promised to have charges in India against Gupta dropped in exchange for Pannun's killing in New York. Now come 2 more questions. The first, in conversations intercepted by the Americans, unlike Pannun, why was Hardeep Nijjar not named and referred to only as a big target, even as late as June the 12th? Such an omission actually helps just one party, the Americans. It absolves them, explains their inability to warn the Canadians and prevent Nijjar's killing 6 days later. But does it? Let's go a step further to the second question. Even if they did not get Hardeep Nijjar's name, why did the Americans fail to alert the Canadians when it was amply clear that those planning the hit on this big target in Canada, a Khalistani just like Pannun in New York, was serious? Yes, serious enough for the Americans to have not only put together a surveillance and sting operation, but as you can see here, listen in to Gupta when he told CS, their undercover confidential source, "We are doing their job, brother. We are doing their New York and Canada job." A job on a big target in Canada. Think about it. There are not that many big targets who would have needed protection. In 2018, India had given Trudeau a list of Canadian Khalistanis wanted by it on terror-related charges. There were just 10 names. One was Hardeep Nijjar. The Canadian Secret Services, as we will soon see, were in regular contact with Nijjar right up to his death. They could have protected him had they been told by the Americans what they were hearing. There are more curious issues. The Indian conspirators, Gupta and this ex-CRPF man, discussed a murder contract, not in Nepal or Sri Lanka, but in the US, home to the redoubtable NSA. They did this not on burner phones, not using VPN, not in any kind of code, but in English and Hindi, leaving messages on their mobiles linked to traceable IP addresses. Bit of a Disney script here? No, all of this is in the indictment. Is it fact, fiction, or fantasy? Secondly, the CRPF man refers respectfully to Nikhil Gupta as Bhaiji. Few Indian cops would show such deference to a crook, especially someone like Gupta who they are misusing, blackmailing really, to do a dirty job. Again, uncomfortably close to a script written out in the US by some intern maybe at the CIA. Indian cop, simple fellow, unsophisticated, cleaning up Gupta's criminal record. Where? In Gujarat, Modi's home state. Easy assumptions, right? Others have done this sort of thing too, but come to regret it. Like a South African cricket captain called Hansie Cronje 20 years ago. I follow these things very carefully. I'll tell you sometime in another episode of Second Opinion about the saintly Hansie and a massive conspiracy. He made a huge error about the competence of Indian police officers. So did many of our talking heads in India. Are yara tullas, how would they know about an international conspiracy? Well, they did know everything, down to the last immaculate detail. About Saint Hansie, the little crook, who'd been paid a lot of money by another Gupta, by the way, Mukesh Gupta, to fix cricket matches. So think about it. Would a CRPF officer speak on a mobile phone about a hit he's arranging in the US? Leave messages to be listened to later. Ask someone to save his contact details on that very same phone. Dal mein kuch kala hai. Of course, and all of it, believe it or not, is right there in that indictment. Still, I must be clear. An Indian role cannot be ruled out. These things do happen everywhere. Someone may have seen an opportunity, planned a hit, 2 hits, possibly. But if this is true, the US had a problem, definitely. The American sting operation was at the end of May last year, 2023, and they couldn't push India too far. Not when Narendra Modi was getting ready for a very high-profile trip to Washington, D.C., with a guard of honor at Joint Base Andrews, a reception at the White House by the Bidens, an invitation to address a joint meeting, a rare joint meeting of the US Congress, where he would be calling Kamala Harris head of the Samosa Caucus. US President Joe Biden was then due in New Delhi 2 months later for the G20 summit in September. Hardly a good time to accuse India of planning a hit, a killing, right there in the US, exactly at that time. So what did the Americans do? They told Trudeau just enough about the killing in Canada, after it had happened. Not about their own sting operation on the Indians, from which they got the information they gave to him. And Justin, of course, asked no more. Not least why the Americans had failed to warn him about the impending hit on a big target in Canada. In effect, by making Canada's Prime Minister their messenger boy, the Americans made sure India got their message, gave them time to assess choices until Biden had returned from India after the G20 summit. There are other possibilities too, as far as Justin picking a fight with India goes. He may have seen an opportunity to distract the Canadian public from some major problems at home, which we shall be looking at. The most intriguing scenario, however, concerns factions in Canada's security services, the Mounties and CSIS, who may have had their own agendas and plans for Justin Trudeau. Canadian spies plotting against their own Prime Minister. Yes, everyone knows about ISI in Pakistan, but such things happen even in the heart of the English-speaking Western world, of which Canada is of course a part. Take the rumors about the CIA and the assassination of US President John F. Kennedy. 55, 60 years later, they still refuse to go away. Then there's MI5, Britain's domestic counterintelligence agency. In the 1970s, British Prime Minister Harold Wilson feared that MI5 and the CIA were plotting a coup to replace him with Louis Mountbatten. Yes, our very own Lord Mountbatten, India's last viceroy, uncle of King Charles and friend of Nehru. That conspiracy by British spies against their Prime Minister is discussed in great depth in Spycatcher, a book promptly banned in Britain. Unlike most Kennedy CIA conspiracy theorists, however, Spycatcher's author was no muckraking tabloid hack. Peter Wright had previously been assistant director of MI5. Or think of Australia, whose Secret Service defied a direct order from Prime Minister Gough Whitlam to cut ties with the CIA. Whitlam was soon removed from office. This was 1975. Yes, all this about the CIA conspiring with Australian spies to kick out their own Prime Minister emerged just a few years ago. The truth had been buried for decades. That too is part of the rules-based international order. Canada's story is, however, quite different. Unlike Australia or Britain, where spies plotted against their prime ministers, in Canada it was a prime minister plotting against his spies. And just who was that prime minister? Well, none other than Justin's daddy, Pierre Trudeau, Canada's PM from 1968 to 1979, and then again from 1980 to 84. Trudeau Sr. did not trust his spies. Funnily enough, about handling a Canadian separatist movement in the province of Quebec. That story about Justin's father, his spies, and their serious, almost alarming differences about how to handle separatism in Quebec emerged at the end of August last year in what is known as the Fantan File. Just 3 weeks later, Justin proceeded to make his dramatic accusations against India about its role in the death of Nijjar, a Khalistani separatist in Canada. Fantan was set up by Pierre Trudeau. Its existence had been buried deep for half a century, just like the story in Australia about Prime Minister Gough Whitlam and the CIA. Justin Trudeau, by the way, seems to be conceived amidst all the Fantan excitement. His father had married his mother, 30 years younger than he, on March 4th, 1971. They had met on a beach in the Pacific Paradise Islands of Tahiti. The marriage ceremony was a secret. So was Fantan, set up that very same month, March 1971. Little Justin was born on December 25th that year, a Christmas baby as it were. Very nicely timed. But there was more here than just secrecy, fun and games. These were also times when Pierre Trudeau had thought, hear this carefully, when Justin's daddy had thought about invoking the War Measures Act and using Canada's military, the full force of the Canadian military, against Quebec separatists, even if his own intelligence service was dead set against it. That, of course, was why Fantan was set up in secret. As I've just said, Trudeau's dramatic statement about Indian spies and Khalistani separatists came barely 3 weeks after revelations on Fantan, which concerned Canadian spies and Quebec separatists. Something here? Well, in both cases, apart from Justin and his own father, the common thread consists of Canada's intelligence services and separatists. Not just Canadian separatists, but Indian too. Indeed, it is in Canada, not India, where the Khalistan problem was resuscitated, and where the Canadian Secret Services kept contact, recently very close contact, with Khalistani separatists like Hardeep Nijjar. Still, in spite of these overlaps and parallels, it would be vulgar to think there are any real similarities between Khalistani and Quebec separatists. The differences are much bigger, above all, in their impact. Let's take a look. Yes, a massacre in India, the bloody result of just one attack on a bus in Lalru. There were several dozens more. Dilwan, Muktsar, Hoshiarpur. Then there were trains, wedding processions. As I just said, it would be vulgar to compare any of this with Canada's problems in Quebec, because the body count of 38 from just this one incident at Lalru was 10 times more than Canada's bothersome separatist caused Justin's father over the entire decade he was Prime Minister. Justin Trudeau himself would have been a teenager during all this, just as he was 2 years before those 38 deaths on a bus in India, when Canada-based Khalistani separatists blew up Air India Flight 182 early one morning in June 1985 out of the summer sky. Flight 182 had taken off from Toronto. The death toll from its bombing off the coast of Ireland on its way to India was 329. That, by my own calculations, is 60 more than Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland 3 years later in 1988, which would be the single biggest act of terrorism against the US until 9/11. The Americans never forgot Lockerbie, even after 9/11. Nor did they forgive Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi, who they blamed for it until his particularly brutal and savage killing, his extrajudicial execution, one might say, in 2011. Hillary Clinton had a very good laugh about the way he died.
Yes, we came, we saw, he died. Did it have anything to do with your visit? No, I'm sure it did.
Even as recently as 2022, the Americans were still out to avenge Lockerbie, here in terms of snatching someone from Libya. And doing this 35 years after the bombing itself and a decade after Gaddafi was thrown out of power and lynched. For some reason, the good Justin has a problem accepting parallels between his daddy's war on Quebec separatists and India's on Khalistanis. But neither, it seems, can he see why India's feelings about the Air India bombing may be exactly like those which the US still has about Lockerbie. He named June 23rd, the date Air India 182 was blown out of the sky, killing everyone on board, Victims of Terrorism Day, not Flight 182 or Air India Memorial Day. This may be why, according to an Angus Ride poll, 9 out of 10 Canadians have no idea about the Air India bombing, even though the plane had taken off from Toronto, and even though the incident by far remains the worst act of terrorism involving Canada to date. Like Trudeau's public, others have forgotten too, or choose to do so. Look at this recent masterpiece from Time magazine. India says this beacon of quality journalism is targeting Sikhs, not Khalistanis or extremists, not terrorists who openly threaten India. No, India is targeting Sikhs at home and around the world. In its analysis, Time magazine has nothing to say about India's worst grievance against Canadian Khalistanis, the bombing of that Air India plane. Can you believe it? Time magazine does not mention it even once. So what exactly explains Justin's ambivalence on Khalistan? The answer isn't tough. Trudeau needs votes from a small group of Khalistanis in key Canadian electoral battlegrounds. Such swing voters also interest Jagmeet Singh, Canadian Sikh who leads the NDP, the New Democrats, and supports Trudeau in Parliament for now. Jagmeet has his own problems. The NDP was routed in the last elections when its seat count in Parliament fell to half. So, Jagmeet is going to need every vote he can get, even if it means going head-to-head against Justin Trudeau for Khalistani swing voters. Those who hate the BJP hate Modi. Jagmeet has made quite clear what he thinks. No stone unturned, says Jagmeet. In 2020, he had accused Modi of stoking, I quote, stoking the fire of hate. Now he makes a vow to all Canadians to hold Modi accountable for the allegations about Nijjar's killing. Not for the evidence about Nijjar's killing, but for the allegations. Jagmeet has studied law. He surely knows the difference. This is electoral politics at its most vulgar, emotive and risky. The leaders of two Canadian parties, Justin and Jagmeet, competing for Khalistani votes, cheer-led by Time magazine, which does not seem to see the difference between a Sikh and a terrorist. I don't wish to sound like an oracle, but it isn't too difficult to glimpse the future. Canada will become a tricky place for Canadians, all Canadians, after a marginal issue in India, Khalistan, with its legacy of blood, bitterness and violence, moves to centre stage in Canada's own domestic politics. The amazing Justin Trudeau would have helped bring it there. Let's return to Fantam and Justin's father, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau's games with his spies, and how exactly this concerns India, beyond also being about spies and separatists. For Professor Greg Keeley, a University of New Brunswick historian, Fantam shows why Canada must be much more transparent about its intelligence operations. No question about that. Canada's intelligence operations do concern India, as we are going to see. One of the best places to begin would be to ask just what CSIS, the Canadian Secret Service, was doing with Hardeep Nijjar, who they met every week according to his own son. And maybe also determine exactly which skeleton stumbled out from the Fantam cupboard just 3 weeks before Justin Trudeau got up in his parliament to accuse the Indian government of Hardeep Nijjar's killing. But then, it wasn't just India. Justin Trudeau had been having problems with China too, as well as facing fallout from a massive scandal in Libya involving one of Canada's largest companies. Like Fang Tan, all these challenges came to a head in summer between Hardeep Nijjar's death in mid-June and Justin's sensational speech in Canada's Parliament 2 months later. So even if Justin felt that the Americans were not telling him everything, he may have also sensed an opportunity. A frontal collision with a country like India, accusing it of carrying out a murder on Canadian soil, would surely divert attention at home from problems with China, Fang Tan and Libya, and 2 of his own ministers who had resigned because of the Libyan scandal. Let us begin with China. In November 2022, CSIS, the Canadian Secret Service, informed Trudeau that the Chinese government had funded 11 candidates in elections in Canada. Justin, however, could do very little about that. When he tried, China's President Xi Jinping slapped him down. This was at the G20 summit in Bali, Indonesia in 2022, the one before New Delhi. Justin backed off, but then back home, his public was not happy, even as late as last June, about how he had handled China.
Chinese interference in the heart of the Canadian democratic process, and an inability to do anything about it. Humiliating, of course, but also politically damaging, as these polls suggest. Note once again, this was just days before Nijjar was killed.
After losing this round with the Chinese, taking on another giant Asian country changed the mood of his voting public. Justin probably hoped so. At Bali, what ticked Xi Jinping off got him so visibly annoyed with Justin? Well, simple. Canada's Prime Minister had been caught red-handed, leaking the content of confidential conversations to reporters. Now, that is not okay. Private discussions between heads of government, ministers and ambassadors is private. That is a cardinal rule of diplomacy, of statecraft. You violate that tenet of privacy, expect sanctioning, which is just what she did in public. That difference between private and public, what you say in one and do not say in another, is the crux of India's problem with Justin Trudeau.
Credible allegations of a potential link.
Credible or not, those allegations of our potential link should have been kept private and followed through to a decision of one kind or another. Canada's Foreign Minister Melanie Joly had this to say about those allegations.
The allegations that a representative of a foreign government may have been involved in the killing of a Canadian citizen here in Canada on Canadian soil is not only troubling, but it is completely unacceptable. If proven true,
what does that mean? There was no proof. So why did Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, get up in his Parliament and accuse the government of India of murdering someone in Canada in cold blood? Because the United States of America had given him no choice. On his part, Joe Biden said nothing about what the US had already found, they'd found 10, 12 weeks before. What the Americans did was wait and see how India reacted to Trudeau. They then got someone way down the line to level their own charges about an Indian hit job in New York, disseminating this via leak to the Financial Times, a British business daily. See how the Americans play it. Make Justin Trudeau fire a warning shot in Canada, then get a newspaper in London to follow up. Have the mastermind Nikhil Gupta picked up in the Czech Republic, a country always eager to please the Americans. Yes, even when it met their Prime Minister Zeman pretending to have evidence linking Saddam Hussein to 9/11. Let's see what comes next from Australia, another part of the rules-based international order. Now, I don't wish to be frivolous. Justin Trudeau had a choice. As far as India was concerned, his actions were hostile. Friendly countries do not always tell one another what they're up to, even in the West. Not even when they're spying on their own friends. Yes, that happens more or less all the time. But if caught, their prime ministers and presidents do not yell about it in public. The Americans have been spying on the Germans for a very long time. But then the Germans have also been spying for the Americans on other Europeans for a very long time. But wait a minute here. While the Germans were spying for the Americans on the Belgians, the Americans got the Danes to spy on the Germans, right to the very top, tapping Chancellor Angela Merkel's cell phone since 2002. Who would have believed that? Remember, the flip side of the rules-based international order, the expendable ally. I could go on here. There are hundreds of examples. But for Justin Trudeau, the best ought to be the case of Shamima Begum, the so-called ISIS bride, which pitted Canada's intelligence services against those of Britain. Well, did Rishi Sunak stand up in the House of Commons and accuse the government of Canada? No. But neither did Justin accuse Rishi in his House of Commons. When caught leaking info at Bali to the press, Trudeau had told Xi Jinping that he believed, presumably unlike the Chinese, in being open with Canadians. He had of course also been open with Canadians about the allegations of an Indian hit on Hardeep Nijjar. Well, why wasn't he open about this mess up with something as problematic as ISIS, which unlike the Khalistanis, targets white people? No, there would have been no need for that. This little Anglo-Canadian ruckus must have been quietly sorted out between MI6 and CSIS over a cup of tea. So what then was Trudeau's motive in going public about India in such a hurry? We've already looked at, being forced by the Americans, needing a diversion for his public from Fan Tan, or from the humiliating lecture which he had been given by Xi Jinping in public. Justin may have been facing psychological pressures too. 6 weeks before he accused India of murder, his wife and he had ended their fairy tale marriage. Justin announced this on Instagram, saying it had been a difficult period. It must have been. The last Canadian Prime Minister to separate from his wife while in office was Justin's own daddy. But little Justin was just 6. But there was more. For a period of time, Justin Trudeau had been fighting a huge corruption scandal. And there was a real threat of it being rekindled just around when Hardeep Nijjar was shot dead. Shortly before Canada's last elections in 2019, SNC-Lavalin, the country's biggest engineering company, had been accused of fraud and bribery, as well as paying out millions of dollars for wine and women and God knows what else. Because of this scandal, Justin Trudeau's own future seemed to be on the line. Jody Wilson-Raybould, who was both Attorney General and Minister of Justice, had accused Trudeau of pressuring her to cut a deal on SNC-Lavalin. She had resigned. So had another minister, Jane Philpott, citing, I quote, serious concerns about Trudeau. The resignations had already put Justin Trudeau in a tight and tricky spot. In December that year, SNC-Lavalin pleaded guilty. But unfortunately for Justin, the story did not shut itself down. Almost 2 years later, Wilson-Raybould accused Trudeau of trying to force her, not just to cut a deal, but to also lie about SNC-Lavalin. Behind his cutesy pie goody two-shoes image, Trudeau is ruthless. As if Wilson-Raybould's resignation was not enough, he had her kicked out of the party too. This wasn't minor stuff, An inquiry was opened by an ethics committee about political interference on the SNC-Lavalin case. Then, all of a sudden, in June last year, just 2 days after Hardeep Nijjar's killing, the charges against Justin were dropped. The evidence against him was obviously not credible enough. Or was there a trade-off of some kind? Politics is often about compromises, deals behind closed doors. Just before Trudeau was let off, an opposition politician had been convicted for similar but much less serious charges of political interference. 2 kinds of infractions indeed. Here was Smith, Danielle Smith, who headed the provincial government of Alberta. What had she done? Well, breached the Conflict of Interest Act by making a phone call to one of her ministers about COVID-19. That was found to be wrongful. So what about Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada, accused by his own top law officer, the Attorney General no less, of trying to not just make her cut a deal, but to also lie? Wouldn't that draw attention? An American messenger boy or an opportunist? Could Justin also have been a victim? Did someone else see the need to shift attention from something by making Justin collide quite pointlessly with India? India may benefit from Nijjar's killing, but some others would too, probably much more from the ruckus created by Justin Trudeau about it. China, for a start. Maybe something to do with the COVID pandemic, about a Canadian government lab transferring viruses to Wuhan. Think about it. What if some kind of bargain was struck here, with elements inside this Canadian Secret Service, who saw a need to shut down questions about China's interference in Canadian elections, or even the lab in Wuhan? Once again, note the date here, June the 10th, just 8 days before Nijjar was killed. Blaming India, its government, for a cold-blooded murder in Canada would do just fine in distracting attention there. That pro-Chinese faction could well be a rogue one. The Canadian Secret Service, as we shall see, is hardly a tight ship. Look at this news clip. A Canadian intelligence official making money from criminals. Not just any official, this Mr. Cameron Ortis. He was Director General of the National Intelligence Coordination Unit. The kind of people he was selling secrets to, like the news article here says, would include people like Hardeep Nijjar, who, as Nijjar's own son confirmed, regularly met with Canadian spies. Cameron Ortis' conviction came barely a week before the Americans leaked news about their sting operation in New York, and information of the impending hit by the Indians on Hardeep Nijjar in Canada. Behind the US and Chinese angles to this, there are some others. Many people would of course benefit from Justin Trudeau's dramatic and pointless attack on the Indians. Pakistanis? Yes. But what about the Ukrainians? There is little love lost there. Remember the way Indian medical students were kicked around in trying to leave Ukraine after the Russian invasion? They were not blonde and blue-eyed, protection priorities for the police, as this ultra-smart Ukrainian government spokesman made clear.
Me, I'm sorry, it's very emotional for me because I see European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed.
South Bloc is a gentle kind of place. When Ukraine was running around looking for main battle tanks to fight Russia, no one in New Delhi was reminding them politely about the 300 T-80s which they'd given away to Pakistan. Yes, indeed, Ukraine and India. As I said, little love lost there. Ukraine's bitterness was an open display after India crafted the G20 declaration in New Delhi and did not haul up Russia. Much of the Western media had expected, almost was certain, that the summit would fail due to such divisions about Ukraine. But that did not happen. So then, wouldn't the Ukrainians have much to gain too by driving a wedge between India and the West? Again, like the Americans, via Canada, using the amazing Justin Trudeau as a conduit. Let's see how that would have been possible. Look at Justin and Zelensky here, two buddies bonding at the Canadian Parliament. But then poor Trudeau. He also cheered another special invitee from Ukraine, 98-year-old Yaroslav Hunka. Now, just 2 weeks after he had got up to accuse India in that very same parliament, something much more problematic than Justin's other wars. Hunka, kneeling up front in the middle, had been a proud member of the Galicia division of the Waffen-SS, the sword arm of the Nazis during the Second World War. Justin Trudeau had just handed Vladimir Putin a trump card. To justify their attack on Ukraine, the Russians have long tarred Ukrainians with the Nazi brush. Putin, as expected, brought up Hunka's invitation to the Canadian Parliament as proof of the Nazification of Ukraine, right to the top. Hunka's tryst with Canada's Parliament was to cost its Speaker his job. Then, after feverish denials for several months, it turned out that it was Justin Trudeau who had invited Hunka to the Canadian Parliament. Now comes the very big question. Not about Justin, but CSIS, Canada's intelligence agency. Didn't they know that Yaroslav Hunka was an SS veteran? If they did not, one must wonder too just what they knew and what they told Trudeau or did not tell him about Hardeep Nijjar, who they were meeting regularly. If they did know about Hunka's past, his Nazi past, and did not tell Trudeau, the story gets very murky. Whether are they out to humiliate Justin, see him gone? Justin may not give too much weight to the Air India plane which took off from Canada and blown out of the sky by Khalistanis. But what about celebrating Yaroslav Hunka, the kind of Nazi 45,000 Canadians had died fighting during the Second World War? Or to get back to the big target which the Americans knew about on June the 12th from their sting operation in New York. Did they tip off CSIS, who then did nothing about it, wishing to get Justin into trouble with India in a battle which he will lose? Or was someone at CSIS involved in the hit on Hardeep Nijjar? Very tricky questions. Now for some final thoughts. These are not about Justin, but his father Pierre, who had sought for years to pull Canada out of NATO, the very same NATO choreographing the current Ukrainian campaign against Russia. Pierre Trudeau set up CSIS in summer 1984 in one of his last major acts as Canada's PM, just 10 days before quitting office. The establishment of CSIS irritated the Mounties, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who had until then been more or less exclusively responsible for intelligence. The rivalry now between the Mounties and CSIS is intense, and as far as India is concerned, the bad blood between the two goes to the heart of a symbol of Canada's messing around with Khalistani, namely Air India Flight 182. 2010, John Major, a Canadian Supreme Court judge, found that a cascading series of errors by RCMP and CSIS had allowed the bombing to take place. Are there skeletons in that cupboard somewhere? Information about security lapses, failures, about inside collaboration, tip-offs. Was that the kind of stuff people like Canadian intelligence official Cameron Ortis have hustled? Two people like Hardeep Nijjar. Why pick in this silly fashion on India? Justin Trudeau has no chance of winning this head-to-head. The US and India will find a way out. They did just that after the Devyani Khobragade incident, when an Indian diplomat, a female Indian diplomat, was strip-searched in the US on the flimsiest of pretexts. There are many parallels there, diplomats and spies, and the crossing of red lines, unspoken boundaries. Yes, the pretext for strip-searching Devyani Khobragade was flimsy, so flimsy that few remember it anymore. But it was not so at the time. Then, even the meek and mild Dr. Manmohan Singh was livid, as India ratcheted up the pressure in a textbook case of power diplomacy. I'll be looking at that case at some point. Indeed, one does not need a PhD in history to know that the relationship between existing and fast emerging great powers will not always be easy. But neither does it need to be zero-sum. Britain was a superpower before the US. India is likely to be one some point in the years ahead. Canada is nowhere in that picture. For now, all I can say is poor Justin. He's likely to be leaving his job quite soon. He may try to forget what he said about India, but Indians, I suspect, will not forget him. Trudeau's former Justice Minister, Jody Wilson-Raybould, did not. Her book, where she takes Justin Trudeau apart piece by piece, is called Indian in the Cabinet. That title, of course, gives political correctness another facet of complexity. Wilson-Raybould is an Indigenous Canadian, another of the people across so many different places around the world, found by busy Europeans looking for Mother India and calling whoever they came across Indians. Thanks for watching, and put a like if you wish, or better still, subscribe to Second Opinion. There are a lot of things to talk about. See you back here. Bye-bye.